Can everybody hear me, I hope? Is that okay, Brittany?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. My name's Joan McCarty, and I grew up on Long Island, and I had a background. I learned to sew and do embroidery and as a young child. And as time went on, I went off to school and have degrees in anthropology and art history. And then suddenly I had the opportunity to get a loom. It was actually given to me. It was a large one. It was 45 inches wide. And so this gave me another textile thing to get involved in. So I taught classes, I made a lot of things, I attended craft shows, and ultimately I went back to school at Philadelphia Textile to get a couple of years of technical and design training. And that's what brought me to Bloomsburg. I got a job at Bloomsburg Mills in the 80s. And I worked at Bloomsburg Mills for all total about 27 years. I was there until the unfortunate bitter end in 2009, where the mill shut down after 120 years, mostly because of the issues with the economy, the 2008 economy. So I was asked by Brittany to talk about the history of the silk mill. I decided to expand it a little bit more so that perhaps it would, it's going to kind of cover the early textile business in this country. So let's just see. Come on. Okay, went too far. Shoot. There. The making of textiles has always been part of the development of civilizations throughout history. Today, we're going to look at the development of the textile industry in America after the end of the Revolutionary War. Prior to that time, many of the fabrics, notably the more elegant ones, came from Europe or the Far East. Most of the very skilled workers in Europe worked from their homes or in small shops devoted to the weaving and spinning of cloth. Textile making was also tied up with the migrations of people from one country to another. One example is the Huguenots, who, because of religious persecution that left thousands of them dead in France, crossed the Channel to England, where they felt their Protestant faith would be more accepted. Many of them settled in Spitalfields, which is a section of London. Now, this drawing is from the Huguenots of Spitalfields. They have a group in London, and this is a drawing of the woman spinning and one of the looms. So this is pretty much what it may have looked like early on in England. Now, secondly, this is another, same kind of loom, and I want to point out a couple of things because you're going to see as we go through these slides that looms have always sort of been the same. They've always had kind of the same parts, even though, of course, they've become much, much more advanced as time went on. So I think you can see the pointer here, my cursor. And these are the harnesses that come down. And this already looks like it has two harnesses. And on here are heddles that each strand of yarn gets pulled through one at a time towards the front of the loom. And then there, in front of the heddles, there's a reed that once you put the shuttle across with the yarn on it, the reed beats back and puts the yarn into place. And this would be the beam that the yarn is put on in the back. And then on the under his feet here are the treadles. And so the heddles up here and the harnesses were operated by the weaver's feet. And, the looms I've had are basically like that, even today. The Huguenots became key in establishing the woven silk industry in England. Others emigrated from Holland for similar reasons and became very influential in the weaving of woolen fabrics in Norwich, which is just across the North Sea from Holland. In fact, the the king at the time actually invited these Huguenots, and this is a drawing of a couple of them dressed up in their finery. So they were obviously not peasant people. They were, most of them, quite well educated. They were merchants, they were artisans, weavers, of course, spinners, and craftspeople. And when they first came to Norwich, they were considered very odd because this was not the way everybody else dressed, or they didn't eat the same foods. So they were called the strangers because of their lifestyle. And when I was in Norwich last fall, when we could still travel, or I guess it's fall before, and I was able to see that building that still stands, the Strangers building. And they made the strangers, the Huguenots, be inside that building at night. And they weren't allowed to go out after a certain time because they were different, which we see today in our country sometimes. They brought excellent skills with them. And they also brought in all the latest in the fashions from the continent. My third great grandfather, Henry Martin, I'm not sure, 1807 to 1868, was a Huguenot, and he lived in Spitalfields in London. And he was a silk weaver, and his wife Harriet was a silk winder. His father before him was a weaver. Later in the 19th century, weaving began to die out. By this time, many fabrics were coming from Asia and America was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution and producing their own fabrics. Okay, this is a picture I took when in London, in Spitalfields, and this would have been the housing that my ancestors lived in that area. And Spitalfields now is a very kind of upscale area. Okay, now back to the development of textiles after the Revolutionary War. This period was the Industrial Revolution in the US up until the mid-19th century. In 1764, the spinning jenny, and I think it got skipped. Hang on a second. Huh. It doesn't want to go back. We'll get back to that picture later because it is kind of cool. Okay. Oh dear. Okay, sorry about that. This is a spinning jenny. And what the difference here was that, originally yarn was spun with a drop spindle or on a spinning wheel. And so you only could do one thread at a time. So as you can see, he is able with the setup, with the wheel and all the different spindles here. So now multiple threads could be spun at one time, making things go a lot faster. Also in 1775, the Scottish inventor, James Watt, developed a steam engine that became the driving force behind the Industrial Revolution. I would suggest if anybody's interested in this kind of thing, there's a really nice museum in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. It's located where the old steel mill, the Bethlehem Steel Mills was. And it's called the National Museum of Industrial History. And they have all kinds of machines in beautiful condition. And they also have a jacquard loom there and some other things related to weaving. So it's a good field trip if you're down that way. During the early Industrial Revolution, the United States was mostly supplied with fabrics coming from France, which were the luxury fabrics, and England, which were more of middle market fabrics. While the US were still colonies, they were forced to buy Asian goods through England, which of course made it more expensive for them. And this was one of the grievances the colonists had with the crown. Trade directly with China grew dramatically after the Revolutionary War. This is just kind of an interesting thing. This was a family in Ontario County, New York, and this was a list of the household production that they were able to make in 1 year. And this is quite an undertaking when you look at this. This is a lot of weaving, a lot of time. So probably in addition to doing farming, et cetera, they were also weaving and knitting and doing all of these things to keep their family clothed. This is another example of one of those looms that would have been used at that time, and you can basically see the same setup with the harnesses and the heddles, and then the beater that beat the cloth up, and the treadles are kind of covered, but they're down there on the bottom. And these would be like an overhead loom, and a lot of them were just 2 harnesses, and they were often used for rug looms. 2 additional inventions in the late 1700s, the power loom created by Edmund Cartwright of England and roller printing in the 1780s were also instrumental in modernizing the textile industry. This is just an example of an overshot pattern that would have been woven on that hand loom. And some of you may be familiar with this. And this is a woven cloth that then was painted and made into a rug. And I think this is actually, you know, a reproduction of an old one. And I know that some people, you know, they're called floor cloths, I believe. Okay. This is an example. This is the early roller printing, where they would print on cloth. So you would have an engraved copper roller here, and then the fabric would roll underneath, and the design would be printed on the fabric. Now, prior to that, it would have been done with block prints and would have been much, much more time consuming. This is an early example of a power loom. This happens to be a Jacquard loom. And you can see how dramatically it has changed, but you still have, you know, the heddles, and you still have the beater coming up. There are no more treadles anymore because it's now run probably by steam. The first cotton spinning mill in the US was built in 1790 by Samuel Slater, a cotton spinner's apprentice in England. He had memorized the details of England's innovative machines. It was driven by water power in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. In 1793, John and Arthur Schofield started the first factory to card woolen yarns. By the Civil War, there were 1,200 cotton factories and 1,500 woolen ones. So you can see that the industry progressed very rapidly. This is another, this is a closer photo of a Jacquard loom. The Jacquard loom was invented by Joseph Marie Jacquard, based on an earlier designs of 3 other Frenchmen. The machine was controlled by a chain of cards, which you see here, a number of punch cards laced together in a continuous sequence. This loom allowed for unlimited varieties of patterns to be produced. This use of replaceable punch cards to control a sequence of operations is considered an important step in the history of computing hardware. So now you could independently lift one thread as opposed to all the threads that were on a harness. And so it gave them a lot more flexibility. And here is a room full of them. And you can see all the overhead mechanisms and so forth. The things have changed quite dramatically. This is quite an amazing picture. If you look closely, you can see it's woven. This is a portrait of Jacquard, and it was made with 24,000 punch cards in 1839, We actually at the mill had a couple of, one of the Declaration of Independence, and I forget what the other one was, that were done in the same manner. In 1851, the Crystal Palace exhibition opened in London. This gave the textile designers the opportunity to show off their new designs based on new inventions. And this is quite an amazing building. They used a large amount of cast iron, and by this time in 1832, sheet glass had been invented. So all of this is glass. I don't think I have an interior picture, and then after the exhibition, a few years later, they took it all down and then they moved it to South London. And unfortunately, it burned down in 1838. Until the 1850s, the textile industry still depended on dyes that were derived from plants, animals, and insects. Plants such as goldenrod, turmeric, marigold, saffron, and onions produce colors in the gold, yellow, and tan range. The madder plant, and this is a photograph of that, produce shades of red, and you could also get red dye from cochineal insects, but they weren't easy to come by. By using different mordants, which were chemicals, the colors could be altered. So this is an example of dyeing with madder, and by using different chemicals mixed in with the plant matter, you could get all these different shades from one plant. And something I was going to mention here is there's tons of information out there on natural dyeing with plants, if anybody is interested in that. And I am going to put something up later, which will give you a source for some of them. One that I highly recommend is put out by the Brooklyn Botanical Garden in New York. And it's just called, I think it's natural plant dyeing or dyeing with natural plants. And I just checked on Amazon last night and it's still in publication. It's $15. And if anybody's interested in that kind of thing, I would recommend it. And I'll try to put that down later too for you. The sea mollusk allowed for royal purple, like the color you see here. This was in high demand and very, very expensive. Certain lichen, Umbilicaria, for instance, produced a purple dye and was less expensive. True indigo, a member of the pea family, was the source for traditional indigo blue. The mordants also help with the brightness and fastness of the natural dyes. Chrome, urea, potassium sulfate, or alum, and iron were some of the chemicals used to help set the dyes. Some minerals produce colors, but these were mostly used in painting and in murals and not on cloth. In 1856, the first aniline dyes were discovered by W.H. Perkins in England. These allowed for much more intense colors with superior fastness. Perkins, born in London, 1838, began to work in a lab at the Royal College of Chemistry at age 15. He studied under the direction of August Wilhelm van Hoffman, who was trying to synthesize quinine to be used in the treatment of malaria. Through this process, Perkins stumbled onto the first commercial chemical aniline dye. The first color he made, he named Movine, and this is it. And this enabled people to dye much larger amounts of cloth. The source for the aniline was coal tar, which was readily available, and Perkins was eventually able to make dyes that were commercially out there for the whole textile industry. Ultimately, he became quite rich and was knighted for his work. And here's a couple of other colors. You can see how bright and intense they are. These were done with aniline dyes. The invention came at the perfect time for Britain because they were already leading in the Industrial Revolution. Eventually, however, it was the Germans that became the leaders in different kinds of dyes. This is a photo of Perkins. It was said of him that by laying the foundation for synthetic organic compounds, Perkins helped revolutionize the world of fashion. In 2013 in Middlesex, another part of London, the school was opened in his honor. It was the William Perkins, or is the William Perkins Church of England High School. And I just thought this was sort of interesting. You can see the color scheme. They have the purple. The kids all have purple jackets, and all the chairs are also the same color. Dyeing fabrics with natural dyes is very labor intensive, and the results are not always as fast and brilliant as synthetic dyes. Today, we have a vast array of types of dyes suited for both natural and synthetic fibers. Now, this is just a list of different types of dyes that are out there. The reactive dyes are specifically for cotton, and they bond with the fiber in cold water solution with washing soda added. Protein fibers, wool, silk, and feathers, which can also be dyed with reactive dyes. Heat and an additive is used with these fibers. Dispersed dyes are dyes that are specific for polyester. A carrier must be used to swell the fibers so that they accept the dye stuff. And cationic dyes are another kind of dye that are for cationic polyester, which has a different chemical makeup, and that allows to dye two different, if you have yarns that are dispersed yarns and cationic yarns in one fabric, which we did at Bloomsburg Mills, you could dye both at once by having these two different dyes in the dye bath. So you would, what looked like just a plain fabric would come up striped or plaid, depending on the arrangement of your yarns. Acid dyes were used primarily for wool and can be used on other protein fibers. They are today's aniline dyes. They strike fast and sometimes unevenly, so the pH and temperature must be carefully controlled. Vat dyes are used on cotton and other cellulosic fibers. Indigo, which was the original, blue jean kind of color, was the first vat dye. I put two sources at the bottom, and I'm going to put this page into a chat later. These are both great sources if you're interested in playing around with dyeing or even painting on fabric. They also have books. I just looked at Dharma Trading today, and they have all kinds of interesting books on natural dyeing. So now we're going to move on to what I was supposed to talk about in the beginning, the history of the silk mill. For more than a century, producing or finishing fabrics, carpets, and lingerie was the largest industrial enterprise in Bloomsburg. This statement was made in 2002, and as you probably know, is not the case today. Textile manufacturing in the US often was in second place to steel, both of which have lost their positions in more recent years. In the beginning of war in Bloomsburg, it was the manufacture of silk fabrics. By 1840, a cocoonery was built by W.G. Harley and Robert Cathcart on First Street between Market Street and the Craigs, if you know where that is, that big building that's up at the, on the dead end off of Route 11. The cocoonery was where the silkworms that produced the silk filaments were grown. Mr. Cathcart bought the land between First Street and the Chrisman Alley and the rock cliff that drops down to Fishing Creek, next to the old Rosemont Cemetery. He used the land to plant wheat, corn, and oats so he would enrich the soil and ultimately plant mulberry trees. Eventually, 300 trees were planted. Now, this is a photo not from Bloomsburg. This is a photo I took in Thailand. And this is a young woman who is tending the silkworms. And these are the little worms before they spin their cocoons. And I don't see them in the picture, but she would be feeding them mulberry leaves because that's the only thing they eat. And then over here at the bottom, these kind of gold colored things are the actual cocoon that the worm spins around itself once it reaches the pupa stage, and it spins and spins in a one continuous thread, which is at least a mile long. And that's basically done the same way. There is no, faster way today. A bill was found for some cost involved with the cocoonery from August 3rd, 1841. For 1/8 of an ounce of silkworm eggs, it was $5.75. $12.50 was paid to Catherine and Sarah Weaver for feeding the silkworms. And then there was a charge for flossing. And I have a photo here, which is from this area, which was the reeling of the silk from the cocoon. This operation turned out not to be successful, and the building was sold in 1847 to Thomas Bomboy, and where they then held concerts and minstrel shows. I think if you can look at this, you can see the little cocoons, and they're drawing them all up, and then they're going to be winding them all off. So they employed these young girls. I don't know how long they had to work to get $12.50 to do this job. In the middle of the century, silk was quite a luxury. The majority of it came from China. Oh, before we go that far, I wanted to mention about the silkworms. They go through 4 stages of development. They have an egg, and then the larva, the caterpillar or the worm, and then the pupa, and then ultimately the moth. Today, silkworms only live in captivity. They have lost their ability to fly. The pupa is what the caterpillar turns into after spinning its cocoon. The worm sheds its skin 4 times in the process of growing, and they eat only mulberry leaves, which makes it more difficult to grow them. After 1 month of eating, a silkworm spins a cocoon, which is these little things here, with 1 mile of silk filament. This is a single strand. The grub is then terminated so that the silk can be reeled off in one continuous thread, because if he burst through, that would bust up the threads. Okay. In the middle of the century, silk was quite a luxury. The majority of it came from China, Japan, and Italy. During the mid-19th century, Paterson, New Jersey became the U.S. Center for silk weaving and dyeing. There were at one time 300 firms with over 11,000 employees. In Northeast Pennsylvania, many people were employed in the iron business. The wages were low and the work difficult. Their sons and daughters were attracted to higher paying jobs of the textile industry that was starting up. Also, much of the iron ore had been exhausted and new jobs were needed. The first silk mills in Northeast PA opened in Scranton in 1873. Columbia Silk Throwing was established in 1874, and that is local to Bloomsburg. They wound the skeins of raw silk, added twists to the filament yarn, which made it stronger. Filament yarns are made with a continuous length of thread, as opposed to cotton and wool, which have different staple lengths. In 1888, a group of town leaders in Bloomsburg were searching for so-called clean industries to bring into the community. They were willing to provide land and a building. At that same time, Joseph Ratay, who was born in Milan, Italy in 1846, he was a nephew of Pope Paul XIII. He decided to leave Italy and to go to Australia to start his own silk business. Somewhere along the line, he got distracted and he ended up in Paterson, New Jersey. Here he felt unwelcome because of the labor unrest among activist immigrants who were considered to be anarchists. So he began to look for better opportunities. He narrowed down 400 possibilities of locations to Binghamton and Bloomsburg. And as you know, he ended up here. This is an early photo of Bloomsburg Mills. This is the original building. All of this has been torn down, unfortunately. And we think that this is Joseph Ratay here, but we're not totally sure. We suspect that it is. And then other buildings were added as time went on. And you can see the Italian flag and the US flag, and it looks like they were kind of drawn onto the photo after the fact. Radai also had the idea that he was going to grow silkworms, but it didn't work out. It just isn't I think it's basically not the right climate to have them. This is interior photo of looms, and it was pretty much one woman to a loom, or one man. And you know, with all the mechanizations that went on between then and say when the mill shut down, you know, a weaver would have a whole set of looms that he could run at, or she could run at one time. But here was pretty much one-on-one. With the support of the Bloomsburg leaders, he built a 3-story building on West 6th Street. Later, he also built factories in Lock Haven, Jersey Shore. He became a US citizen and was considered without peer in the textile industry. He was a stockholder in local businesses, invested in local banks, and was a director of the Montour Columbia trolley line. This is another photo of Bloomsburg Mills. And another one. And this is these little pointy roofs were the weaving shed, and this allowed a lot of natural light to come in. Later on, it didn't become particularly practical, and they were all boarded up. And this is an old map of Bloomsburg. And to orient myself here, here's West 6th Street, going through here, or yeah, West 6th Street, and then it crosses with West Street. So the mill would have been up here, and this is the Bloomsburg woolen something, I'm not quite sure. But, and then the railroad tracks, and some of those tracks are still there, but obviously not that many. This is one of the ads from probably around the 1940s that advertised Bloomsburg Mills fabrics. I think I have one other of those. Yeah, this is another one too, which I think are pretty nice. Let's see. Now here's a little bit later, an interior view of the weaving shed with all the looms set up in place. And you can see you've still got the heddles and the harnesses. You've got the beam in the back, and then there would have been, these would have been shuttle looms. And the shuttle would, it wasn't hand put across the warp anymore, but it would ride on a race plate. And I guess I didn't mention, this is the warp. And then for people who are hand weavers, what went across it was called the weft. But in the commercial business today, it's called filling yarn as opposed to weft. And this would have been the spinning department, and they were taking the yarns and then putting it on the machine and then adding twist to it. Bloomsburg Mills was known for a lot of dress fabrics. They did a lot of fancy crepes and satins that went into women's wear. And so twist added to the yarn, one, makes it somewhat stronger and also gives a particular texture to the fabric. And here we have an overhead view of the whole area. And these are here are the houses that are all long since gone, but these houses were built for the workers, and they could rent them at pretty inexpensively. They were torn down since I've lived here. I think they were taken down in the sometime maybe in the late early 80s. And now you can see you have a lot more looms than you had before. And this is a modern day picture of the mill before it disappeared. And here you can see where the carpet mill was. This is would have been the McGee's building. Another overhead view. Wait a minute. Somewhere some things have gotten skipped. I'm going to go back. Here are the ones I wanted. Okay. Well, Joseph Radai made a return trip in 1906 to Italy, where he maintained a summer home. And unfortunately, he became ill there and died. But before that happened, this is the Joseph Radai Hospital in Bloomsburg. The building still stands. It's down on 5th Street and kind of across from where the knitting mill is. And he was also involved with the original trolley line, the Columbia Montour trolley line. And you'll recognize this downtown Bloomsburg and with the trolleys. And this is a photo of the New York office of Bloomsburg Mills about 1926, which I think is interesting because there's only men there. Okay. After the death of Radai, the Yorks family then took over the mill. First, there was Frederick G. Yorks, and he ran it from 1906 to 1933, and then his son Milton K. Yorks from 1913 to 1942. They built the Yost Mansion that stands across the street from the Bloomsburg Post Office. Frederick had worked in Paterson, New Jersey, and had exceptional knowledge of the business. Milton Yorks added plants in Doria and Reynoldsville. During this time, sales offices were added in New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, and LA. After the death of Milton Yorks, Jacques Weber, who was born in Switzerland and was trained as a technician in Zurich, took ownership of the mill. Under his leadership, Bloomsburg Mills made the transition to synthetic fabrics. He also added plants in Dallas and Abbeville, South Carolina. After his retirement, James P. Marion II, Jacques Weber's son-in-law, took over the running of the business. The Marion family continued to own the company until 2009, when Bloomsburg Mills was closed. All of these owners were involved in the community, serving as directors of banks, trustees of school. Jacques Weber set up a foundation to award scholarships to students. This foundation has given away millions of dollars over the years and remains active today. Bloomsburg Mills survived 2 world wars, a financial panic, and fierce competition from overseas. Originally, the mill did commission throwing and warping. They began weaving in 1891 when the looms were set up. The fabric was made from yarn-dyed silk for umbrellas and ties. It was rumored that silk was kept in the vault behind the office because of its value. Gradually, man-made fibers began to replace the silk. By the end of World War II, it was mostly cellulosic fibers, rayon and acetate. Eventually, polyesters and nylons were added to the mix. In 1892, the mill had 72 employees. In 1897, 280, and by 1920, there were over 600. I believe at their peak, there was 1,000 employees altogether in all the plants. Over the years, the company invested in state-of-the-art looms. The looms came from Germany, the Dornier, Rapier, and Airjet looms, and there were Nissan looms, waterjet looms that came from Japan. These looms enabled the company to diversify its business. And while I was working there, it became harder and harder to compete in the women's wear in clothing. So much of this went overseas. It was the kind of business, because it still was somewhat labor intensive. It was quite well adapted in countries where they had a large, inexpensive labor force. So after the, when the clothing business started to dwindle, Bloomsburg began to diversify. And so we got into other products such as tablecloths, home furnishings, both fire retardant fabrics and regular fabrics, ripstop nylon. We also got into the medical business, Band-Aids and other medical products, belts for machines, even gas tanks for helicopters was one of the more curious projects. Even with modernizations, the textile business was labor intensive. This was made perfect for less developed countries with large and not well paid labor forces to thrive. Overall, the textile business of the US has greatly diminished in the last 30 years. In 1948, it was at its highest peak, 1 million people in textiles and 1.4 in apparel, the cut and sew business. Today, this textile business has somewhat stabilized with technical fabrics in the lead. So for the people that survived all of this, there are still some mills left. There are a lot of industrial types of fabrics. There are a lot of non-woven fabrics, medical fabrics, hygiene fabrics for infection control and accelerated healing, wipes, filtration, surgical products, different kinds of protective products, geosynthetics used in road building, home and office furnishings, transportation, airbags, awnings, and other outdoor fabrics. In 2019, the 18.8 billion worth of products was produced in this country, which was up 20% from 2009. I think I'm going to stop there so that you have a chance for questions if you have any. I have a little bit about McGee's, which I don't know as nearly as much about, but I'll run through these few pictures I have left for you to see. Now this would be, that's McGee's. And these are some photos from the old McGee's, where it's no longer doing this kind of work. This is kind of interesting. This is a Jacquard loom, and these were what the early carpets were woven on. And when McGee's was bought out by Reeder from Switzerland, a group of people founded the Bloomsburg Carpet Mill, which is up on Route 11, and which is today extremely successful. They do a lot of high-end specialty carpets to order. And this is a McGee from McGee's, and this is working on one of the designs, which would all be done on computer today and not hand painted. It's hard to believe they could do that. And this is another picture from inside of the McGee plant with all the cards and all the overhead apparatus for the Jacquard looms. And here's another one. And you can see they're still operating these kind of by hand, and so that's changed. And this last one here is a modern loom that you would find at the Bloomsburg Carpet Company on Route 11. Assistant. And that is it. I'm going to go just to the end. So the threads of our local textile industry have been woven through the fabric of our communities along the Susquehanna. The men and women who have worked in these businesses have contributed much to the texture and variety of life along its banks.